Nice smiles, everybody.
This year's Medicine Prize was awarded for a breakthrough that has touched the lives of millions of families around the world. It was awarded to Professor Robert Edwards, known as the father of IVF. He first gave infertile couples the chance to have a baby through in vitro fertilization. After decades of laboratory and clinical trials, the breakthrough came in 1978 with the birth of Louise Brown, hailed as the first test tube baby.
Perfectly normal baby.
Today, more than 4 million children have been born to parents who were not able to conceive naturally. Professor Edwards is now long retired and is too frail to be interviewed. The news of the Nobel Prize has delighted his family and colleagues.
Everyone burst into tears and hugged each other, and then went to tell Dad. And Dad does know he's won the Nobel Prize, and he's absolutely delighted.
He's over the moon. He's being just suffused with happiness. It really is the cherry on the cake for him.
I leapt out of bed standing in my nightie. I said, oh, you know, and the tears were streaming down my face. I just couldn't believe it.
Infertility affects more than 10% of the world's couples. Fertilization of eggs by sperm takes place in a woman's fallopian tubes, but sometimes natural fertilization is impossible. From the 1960s, Robert Edwards devoted his life working to resolve the problem of infertility.
To him, the most important thing in life was having a child. So he really identified with people that didn't have a child and really believed that he could help them.
The more he heard their stories, I think the more he came to believe there was something here he had to fight for on their behalf. So it was a combination, I think, his belief in social justice and his curiosity as a scientist.
Working in the physiology laboratories at the Downing site in Cambridge, Edwards grappled with many challenges, not all of them scientific.
The whole of reproductive science in Cambridge was considered a little bit separate from other sorts of science. It was not quite respectable. You have to remember, back in the 60s, the word sex very rarely appeared in the front of newspapers. People weren't up front like they are today. Sex was still extremely taboo, even in the swinging 60s, actually.
Edwards worked tirelessly with his little team, using eggs from segments of ovaries obtained from women who had to undergo surgery for medical reasons, and trying to mature the eggs for fertilization.
If I had to think of one word to describe him, I would say enthusiasm. It was like working with a gale force wind. Chaos, mostly.
The first major breakthrough came in 1969, when Edwards achieved the fertilization of a human egg in the lab.
He said, come and look at this, Barbara. But it was a moment of magic, really, because this was when the egg was dividing. I was thrilled, because after all the struggle, we'd done it. It was wonderful.
But the breakthrough was followed by a decade of frustration. The fertilized eggs refused to develop, and Edwards realized he needed to use eggs matured in a woman's ovary rather than in a laboratory dish. He heard about the work of Dr. Patrick Steptoe, who was pioneering keyhole surgery in his gynecological work, and quickly teamed up with Steptoe.
Steptoe and Edwards, what a combination. You've got Bob in the laboratory defining the conditions and doing a lot of the detailed technical work, and you've got Patrick who can actually get the eggs. And they work so closely together, and they share that same fundamental belief that the pain of infertility can be conquered.
For 8 years, the two men worked together to refine their techniques, dashing constantly between Cambridge and Steptoe's unit at Oldham Hospital. They struggled with scepticism and outright hostility.
It was just desperation and frustration and criticism from all sources.
He was certainly accused of all sorts of things, of being a Nazi doctor, of Frankenstein tendencies, of infanticide by killing early embryos and so on. In fact, he took a year out from his work to engage with ethicists and religious teachers and so on to make sure his ethical foundation was correct.
Compounding the widespread criticisms of their work on fertility, the results remained disappointing.
Every week we get the results of these fertilisations and nothing was happening. There was a lot of disappointment and the results had come through and no pregnancies, no pregnancies.
The funding for Edwards and Steptoe's fertility work was drastically cut, and only the support of an anonymous Californian benefactor allowed them to keep going. But at last, in late 1977, Robert Edwards had news.
He called me in one day, he said, I want to tell you we've got our first pregnancy, and I cried.
It wasn't really until I read it in the paper that this woman from Bristol was going to have the first so-called test tube baby. I think that was when I realised that it was very strange. Obviously, I realised that they were talking about me.
Leslie Brown gave birth to the first IVF baby on July the 25th, 1978.
There was always that doubt about whether Louise was going to come out absolutely perfectly. There's a lot of tension there, and I suppose the adrenaline was flowing as well.
Just a perfectly normal baby.
We couldn't celebrate at all, apart from having some tea and some supper. If I remember correctly, we had cheese on toast.
I remember somebody saying, Leslie, wake up, open your eyes, because you've got a little daughter, and I could just vaguely remember seeing a little tiny face.
Over the years since 1978, more than 10,000 babies have been conceived via IVF here at the Bourne Hall unit, created by Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe. Today, more than 30 years later, Louise Brown, the first IVF baby, her mother Leslie, and naturally born son Cameron have joined a celebration of Robert Edwards' Nobel Prize. Patrick Steptoe died in 1988. For Louise and Leslie, the Nobel Award to Robert Edwards has special meaning.
I just thought it was fantastic. It's about time that he's been recognised for all the work that everybody's done. It's just brilliant that someone's finally been recognised. He came to my wedding. I mean, he's just like Grandad.